The person Simon Cowell had destroyed 20 years ago was now standing in front of him, and he had no idea what was about to happen. The studio lights dimmed. The audience fell into a hush so complete you could hear the cameramen adjusting their lenses. Simon Cowell sat frozen at the judge's desk, his hand hovering over the red buzzer, his face drained of color. He wasn't moving. He wasn't speaking. For the first time in the history of America's Got Talent, Simon Cowell looked afraid. Behind him, the other judges exchanged confused glances. In the wings, producers frantically whispered into headsets. Something was wrong. Something had broken the formula. And then, from center stage, a voice Simon hadn't heard in 2 decades spoke his name. "Hello, Simon." 2 words. That's all it took. And in that instant, 20 years of guilt, regret, and buried memory came flooding back. This wasn't just another audition. This was a reckoning. If you want to know how a single moment can rewrite a man's entire legacy, subscribe now, because what happens next will change the way you see Simon Cowell forever. 20 years ago, Simon Cowell was not the man you see today. He was sharper, colder, meaner. Television had turned him into a weapon, and every contestant who walked onto that stage was a target. It was 2004, the early days of talent television. The format was new, the ratings were explosive, and Simon's cruelty was the secret ingredient. Audiences tuned in not to see dreams come true, but to watch them shatter. And Simon delivered, week after week, with surgical precision. One night, a man walked onto the stage. His name was David Mitchell. He was 28 years old, a construction worker from Ohio, and he had spent every dollar he had to get to that audition. He carried a battered acoustic guitar and wore a flannel shirt that had seen better days. When he introduced himself, his voice shook. "I've been writing songs since I was a kid," David said. "This is my shot." Simon didn't even look up from his notes. "Go ahead." David began to play. The song was raw, honest, imperfect. It was the kind of music that came from late nights and broken promises, from a life that hadn't been kind. The melody was simple, but the emotion was real. When he finished, the audience clapped politely. It wasn't a standing ovation, but it was warm. It was human. Then Simon spoke. "That was absolutely dreadful." The room went silent. David's face fell. Simon leaned forward, his eyes cold and clinical. "You have no stage presence, no vocal ability, and frankly, no business being here. You're wasting everyone's time, including your own. This is a professional competition, not a therapy session. Go home, get a real job, and stop embarrassing yourself." The other judges tried to soften the blow, but it was too late. The damage was done. David walked off that stage, and the cameras followed him into a hallway where he collapsed against a wall, his guitar still in his hands, tears streaming down his face. The episode aired. Millions watched. And Simon moved on to the next victim. He didn't think about David Mitchell again. Not for a week, not for a year, not for 2 decades. Until tonight. The contestant standing on the America's Got Talent stage looked older now. His hair was graying at the temples, his hands were rougher, but his eyes, those eyes, Simon recognized them immediately. And in that instant, everything came back. David Mitchell wasn't supposed to be here. According to every logical outcome, he should have disappeared. He should have given up. He should have believed Simon's words and buried his dream under 20 years of regret. But he hadn't. "I'm sure you don't remember me," David said, his voice steady now, stronger than it had been 2 decades ago. "But I remember you. I remember every word you said to me in 2004. Simon said nothing. His jaw was tight, his eyes locked on David. The other judges, Heidi, Howie, and Sophia, leaned in, sensing something profound was unfolding. "You told me I had no business being on that stage," David continued. "You told me to go home and get a real job. And you know what? I listened. I went back to Ohio. I hung up my guitar. I stopped writing. I convinced myself you were right." The audience was silent. Every person in that theater knew they were witnessing something that transcended entertainment. This was real. This was human. But something happened a year ago, David said. My daughter, she's 16 now, she found an old video of me on YouTube. It was that audition. The one where you destroyed me. And she watched it, and then she looked at me and said, Dad, why did you stop? David's voice cracked, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. I didn't have an answer for her. I had spent 20 years believing that one man's opinion defined my worth. That if Simon Cowell said I wasn't good enough, then I wasn't. But my daughter, she didn't see it that way. She said, Dad, he was wrong. And you need to prove it. Simon's hand, which had been resting on the desk, slowly moved to his face. He covered his mouth, and for the first time in the history of this show, the camera caught something no one had ever seen before. Simon Cowell's eyes were glistening. So I'm here, David said. Not to prove anything to you, Simon. But to prove something to myself. And to my daughter. He adjusted the microphone stand, picked up his guitar, the same battered instrument from 20 years ago, and began to play. The song was called 20 Years. And it was about everything. About failure, about shame, about a man who had let someone else's voice become louder than his own. But it was also about redemption. About second chances. About a daughter who believed in her father even when he didn't believe in himself. David's voice was no longer shaking. It was powerful, raw, and absolutely real. Every word landed like a hammer. Every note carried 20 years of silence breaking open. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this performance is still ahead, and you need to see what Simon does next. When the song ended, the silence in that theater was deafening. No one moved. No one clapped. Even the cameramen seemed frozen, unsure if they were allowed to break the moment. David stood on that stage, his chest rising and falling, his eyes locked on Simon. And then Simon Cowell did something he had never done before. He stood up. Not to walk away. Not to leave the stage. He stood slowly, as if the weight of 20 years was pressing down on his shoulders. The other judges stared at him in shock. The audience gasped. This was not in the script. This was not rehearsed. Simon walked around the judge's desk, his footsteps echoing in the silence, and he walked onto the stage. He walked straight toward David Mitchell, and when he reached him, he stopped. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other. The man who had destroyed, and the man who had survived. Then Simon spoke, and his voice was barely above a whisper, but every microphone in that studio caught it. I was wrong. 3 words. That's all it took. And the dam broke. I was wrong. Simon repeated louder now. I was cruel, and I was arrogant, and I thought that breaking people down was the same as being honest. But it wasn't. It was just cruelty. And I'm sorry. The audience erupted. Not in applause, but in something deeper, something more cathartic. People were standing, crying, holding each other. This wasn't just about David. This was about every person who had ever been told they weren't good enough, every dream that had been crushed by someone else's words. David's eyes were streaming now, but he was smiling. I forgave you a long time ago, Simon. I had to, or it would have destroyed me. Simon shook his head. You shouldn't have had to forgive me. I should never have said those things. He turned to the judge's desk, and without a word he walked back. But he didn't sit down. Instead, he placed his hand on the golden buzzer. And he hesitated. This was the moment. The golden buzzer was Simon's nuclear option, the one thing he used maybe once a season, if that. It sent a contestant straight to the live shows, bypassing every other round. It was the ultimate validation. But Simon had never used it like this before. He had never used it as an apology. His hand hovered over the button. The entire studio held its breath. And then, slowly, deliberately, Simon pressed it. Golden confetti exploded from the ceiling. The music swelled. The audience went wild. But Simon wasn't celebrating. He was standing there, his hand still on the button, watching as David Mitchell, the man he had broken 20 years ago, finally got the moment he deserved. David collapsed to his knees on that stage, overwhelmed, and Simon, for the first time in his career, walked back onto the stage and pulled him to his feet. The two men embraced, and the cameras captured every second of it. "You deserved this 20 years ago," Simon said into David's ear, his voice breaking. "I'm just sorry it took this long." Backstage, after the cameras stopped rolling, Simon sat alone in his dressing room. He had done thousands of auditions, judged tens of thousands of performers, and built a career on being the man who told the truth, no matter how harsh. But tonight he had learned something. The truth isn't always harsh. Sometimes, the truth is admitting you were wrong. Sometimes, the truth is saying sorry. And sometimes, the truth is giving someone the moment they should have had 2 decades ago. David Mitchell went on to win that season of America's Got Talent. His story became a sensation, not because of the drama, but because of what it represented, the idea that it's never too late. That 20 years of silence can end with a single song. That forgiveness is more powerful than revenge. And Simon Cowell? He never forgot that night. In every interview after, when asked about his greatest moment on television, he didn't talk about ratings or viral clips. He talked about David. About the man who came back. About the moment he realized that words have weight, and that weight doesn't disappear just because you move on to the next contestant. "I've made a lot of mistakes in my career," Simon said in one interview. "But that night taught me something I should have learned a long time ago. People aren't here for me to judge. They're here to be seen. And I almost missed one of the greatest talents I've ever encountered because I was too busy being cruel." Share and subscribe, so this story will never be forgotten. Because this isn't just about Simon Cowell or David Mitchell. It's about every person who's ever been told they're not good enough, and what happens when they prove the world wrong. The guitar David played that night, the same battered acoustic from 2004, now hangs in his daughter's room. She looks at it every day and remembers the night her father taught her the most important lesson she'll ever learn, that one person's opinion, no matter how loud, doesn't define your worth. And Simon? He keeps a photo from that night on his desk. Not of himself, but of David, standing on that stage, finally getting the moment he deserved. It's a reminder. A reminder that being honest doesn't mean being cruel. That power is nothing without responsibility. And that sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is admit you were wrong. But there's something else that happened that night. Something the cameras didn't catch. Something that changed Simon forever. After the confetti had fallen and the audience had left, after the producers had wrapped and the stage crew had begun breaking down the set, Simon found David sitting alone in the hallway. He was holding that guitar, running his fingers over the worn wood, and he was crying. Not tears of joy this time, but something deeper, something that had been buried for 20 years. Simon sat down next to him. No cameras. No producers. Just 2 men in an empty hallway. "I need you to understand something," David said quietly. "After that audition in 2004, I didn't just give up music. I gave up on myself. I spent years believing I was worthless. I worked jobs I hated. I drank too much. I pushed away people who loved me. Because if Simon Cowell said I was nothing, then I must be nothing." Simon closed his eyes. The weight of those words was unbearable. "My daughter saved my life," David continued. "Not just by pushing me to come back here, but by showing me that I had something worth living for. Someone who believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. And tonight, when you apologized, when you pressed that button, you didn't just give me a second chance. You gave me my life back." Simon didn't speak. He couldn't. He just sat there, this man who had spent decades perfecting the art of criticism, and for once in his life, he had nothing to say. "I forgive you," David said. "Not because you deserve it, but because I deserve peace." Those words, spoken in a quiet hallway long after the cameras stopped rolling, hit Simon harder than anything that had happened on that stage. Because David was right. Forgiveness wasn't about Simon. It was about David finally letting go of the weight he'd been carrying for 2 decades. When Simon finally stood to leave, he placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Thank you," he said, "for coming back. For being brave enough to face me. And for teaching me something I should have learned a long time ago." "What's that?" David asked. "That the most powerful thing we can do is give people hope. Not take it away." 20 years. That's how long it took for 2 men to find their way back to that stage. One to reclaim his dream. The other to reclaim his humanity. And in the end, they both won.